Welcome. I want to welcome everyone to our Senior Citizen Lecture Series. I'm really happy today. We have two very special guests. We have Marty Tankleff, who falsely confessed to murdering his own parents and spent 17 years in prison. He's been exonerated and he is now an attorney. And he's going to talk about his life and experience, and his actual attorney, Amy Marion, who is an amazing Long Island-based attorney who also does a lot of work throughout the country and in New York City, is here with him. And she's going to talk about the problems of wrongful convictions and false confessions and some of her work in this area. She's really a groundbreaking attorney, and it's such an honor. The first time Marty spoke to students at St. Francis College, he was in Nassau County Jail, and he called in before he was exonerated. And we had you on speakerphone. I don't know if you remember, it was in about 2006.
I think it was 2006 because, yeah.
Yeah, it was very, very early in my teaching career here. And I said to the students, do you have any questions for Marty? He's in jail. He's been in jail for 16 years. He's been falsely accused of murdering his own parents. And the students asked him, well, if you do get out, what meal do you want to have? What food do you want to eat? And all the questions were about food. So we had a really good conversation, but hopefully some of the questions today will be more substantive and about some other issues. But that's also...
There are some good food stories, which...
Okay, good.
I'll tell you very quickly, Amy's partner, Bruce, who was one of the lawyers that worked at my 440, I think it was out maybe a week or two, and we went out to lunch. We went to a local place, and I ordered duck tacos and mango iced tea. And he just looked at me, he goes, how many people served 17.5 years in prison would order duck tacos and mango iced tea as like one of their first meals out? He goes, what happened to burger and fries? And Bruce has learned that burger and fries were just not me.
Because there wasn't duck tacos and mango iced tea
Absolutely.
in 1988.
Exactly.
So that's interesting.
And I also want to point out that we have two documentary filmmakers here. They're making a documentary about Marty and his transition from prison to law school to lawyer. So they're taping here, so that's why we have 3 cameras going in case anybody is curious about that. So we're so honored to have you guys here today, and we can't wait to see the documentary. And thank you, Marty, and thank you, Amy, so much.
I just want to say thank you, Emily, because you do great work, and it's so great that you spread the word about what we all do in different areas of social justice and criminal justice, and so we appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak with you all. I'm the boring part of the lecture because I'm not the real person who spent the time in jail, but I will say that soon after Marty was released from jail, my partner Bruce Barket, who was one of the attorneys who actually was responsible for getting Marty out of jail, but Marty himself was his own best advocate, which is just the most important thing, is the person who's actually incarcerated has to rely on themselves to be not only in a jail setting, and the debilitation on your life as somebody who now becomes a prisoner, but also somebody who has to advocate for themselves because could you hear me all? No. That is so rare because I just have such a loud voice. Okay, sorry.
You're not winning a court case. If you're in front of the court judges right now, everyone will hear you.
I yell, yeah, the judges tell me to lower your voice, Miss Marion. So you have to rely on yourself, and so Marty really was his own best advocate, as many exonerees are, because all they do is just file their appeals, file their 440. A 440 is a legal vehicle by which you can set aside a conviction that's different from the appeal. So for a little quick learning, the appeal process goes up straight. The 440 goes sideways, and what I mean by that is that the appeal process is based on the record below. So if you have a trial, okay, let's say you have a trial for the homicide, as Marty did, the homicide of his parents, the appeal is based on everything that was in court. The record below is what was presented to the court below. Anything outside of the record, any evidence that wasn't introduced at the trial, is not a basis for an appeal. If you want to introduce any evidence that was outside of the record, in other words, there was a witness, an alibi witness, who said that Marty, or the individual defendant, the criminal defendant, was with me the entire time when the homicide was alleged to have taken place. That is brought by way of a 440 of the criminal procedure law in the state of New York. And then there are other areas by which you bring what's called a habeas corpus petition when you get up to the federal level. But first you have to exhaust your state remedies, and then you could go over to the federal. I actually have a few slides on this, so let me just go quickly. Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, who was also Marty's attorneys on his cases, founded the Innocent Project close to 2 decades ago. I don't have the handouts on these, I'm sorry, but Emily could contact me and then we could email these to all of you. And this just shows the network of 65 legal organizations approximately now, and it keeps growing every day. I'm going to go through these quickly. We don't really need to go through all of these. But this piece is actually important to me and what I like to grab from this. The most challenging aspect of the innocence narrative remains truly comprehending the unreal dream of being wrongfully convicted and imprisoned. It is a fear that drills into the marrow of our humanity, a nightmare from which each of the exonerated is still trying to awake. Marty just told me when we were having coffee before we got here that he's been out 10 years, and I said to him, how does that, what does that feel like? And what did you say? You didn't really know. What does it feel like 10 years out? I mean, it's an odd thing.
It's hard to fathom it, but I look at it when one of my lawyers was recently asked, what do you think of Marty's successes? And he said, if you look what Marty's accomplished in 10 years, he got a bachelor's degree, got a law degree, took the bar exam, married, adopted a child, has spoken at the NYPD, Georgetown University, John Jay College of Criminal Justice, St. Francis, law schools, has testified before the New York State Assembly, the New York State Senate, the City Council.
All 10 years out. He's discussing since he's been 10 years out.
Hopefully next semester I'll be teaching at Touro Law School and Georgetown, and that's all kind of been within a 10-year window. And sometimes I say, I don't think I've done enough. And the lawyers look at me like, you just keep doing what you're doing.
That's right. He really is. And it's actually amazing to me. We have another employee in our office, Don Taylor, who's also an exoneree. And what's always amazing to me, and it's probably one of the reasons why you guys are out, is that your sense of just hope and drive, and not allowing themselves to be beaten down by really what is the complete degradation of humanity and morality to allow these things to happen in our civilized, so-called civilized society. There's a typo. Civilization struggled with the problem of guilt and innocence throughout history. And in early days, guilt was determined by one or more deities, relieving humans of that burden of uncertainty, though even a God-based justice system had the fundamental problem of interpretation of ambiguous diving messages. Once humankind assumed the role of judge and jurors, errors were inevitable. And in our legal system, the principles are based on recognize this. William Blackstone's principle, it is better than 10 guilty persons escape than one innocent person suffer, prevailed with a presumption of innocence and a standard of evidence of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But, like so many things in our society, their problems arose, right? And many times people, and still to this day, could not understand why somebody would say they're guilty, why somebody would give a confession. It's an odd thing. Or why individuals would not be guilty if the police arrested them, right? So we still live in that society. Scholars have cast doubt on many supposed pillars of justice, such as studies discrediting eyewitness testimony for decades. Innocent men are never convicted, don't worry about it. This was Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who also said, you know what, we don't have the best system here in the United States, in our democracy, but it's better than the alternative, being the fascist system, or a system that presumes innocent individuals to be guilty, and then you have to prove your innocence. I'm here to tell you that even though there is a presumption of innocence in our legal system, bullshit. As a criminal defense attorney for close to 30 years, you have to prove your innocence, and that still exists. And that's the problem. And so when I'm doing a criminal trial, which I do most of the civil litigation now for my firm, but I'm born and raised in the New York City legal aid system as a criminal defense attorney. And born and raised as a lawyer, obviously not born and raised as that. But what is really so essential, and this is what I tell jurors to this day, is that you're sitting there at the table, right, the defense table, and you ask jurors, prospective jurors, when you do your voir dire, and you say, what do you think right now? What would your verdict be? And they say, I don't know. No, wrong answer. Presumption of innocence. Not guilty. That's what your verdict would be. But then I say to them, you're asking regular individuals, non-lawyers, and even lawyers who don't practice criminal defense don't understand this and don't get this. You're asking individuals to get to that place when what are we programmed to think? Well, first of all, you walk into a courtroom, and the only person who's called the defendant, right, not even given a name, is the defendant, right? And the only person, sometimes that individual is surrounded by court officers or U.S. Marshals, right? So that's the only person whose liberty is not, it doesn't have their liberty. And what do we read about in the papers? They got the guy, right? They've been looking for the guy, looking for the serial rapist, serial burglar, looking for the guy. How many people have ever stopped and said, I don't think they got the right guy? When you see it on the news and you're like, they got the guy, right? And the guy's running around your neighborhood and, and really causing harm to your family and your kids and your neighbors. How many people go, I don't think that's the right guy? Nobody says that. Nobody says that because we are programmed to think that the cops go out there, they do their job, they got the guy, and we're all happy as the citizens outside on the street. And then there's this, mind-boggling, not even a juxtaposition, but a complete 180. You walk into the courtroom and you're like, the defendant. So why would any of us say there's a presumption of innocence? Why would any of us think that the presumption of innocence still stands? Right? Because we don't question it. There's a difference between you get in the courtroom and there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And why is it proof beyond a reasonable doubt? It's not technicalities, as people say. It's damn evidence. Because individuals like Marty Tankleff have been incarcerated. And it was only once DNA evidence came about that these positions, Churchill reiterated the sentiment when he stated on November 11, 1947 in the House of Commons that democracy is the worst form of government except for all others.
But I just want to add one thing.
Go ahead, please.
I recently spoke to a group of about 60 people, and I asked them a question, a very simple question. I said, if someone committed a murder in your neighborhood and the police said, we've arrested somebody for the murder, how many people in the room would question, did we arrest the right person? Not a single person raised their hands because they said, we would accept that the police arrested the right person. I go, that's the problem that we as a society need to change. We need to know that the police have arrested the right person because when you don't arrest the right person, the guilty person is remaining free to commit additional crimes and victimize society. And we've seen this in so many cases where we as a society accepted what the police said, that the right person was arrested, and they were wrong.
Only when we were able to, Barry and Peter, were able to establish the Innocence Project in New York City, which began using DNA evidence to prove innocence. And it was only because there was DNA evidence that they were able to change the human condition and the human mind. Why? Because we all want proof. Everybody wants proof. Jurors love DNA. They love fingerprint. They love forensic shit. They love it. Whether or not it's bullshit or not, they love it. And there are huge wars in the legal system over what actually is science and what is not science. And I am here to tell you that there is an inordinate amount of bullshit science, soft science and hard science. So it's soft science is your mental health professionals, psychologists. There is an enormous amount of so-called of experts who are admitted and allowed to testify as to science that is bullshit and is not science. Child sex abuse accommodation syndrome is allowed in every state in this country except for 2, and in New York State it is absolutely upheld as science. It's not science. The guy who invented it, it was a diagnostic tool to help with his therapy. And he has said it's not even close to a science. So it is horrible what goes on in our legal justice system with regard to what is purported to be science and what is not science. So along those lines, besides the fact that individuals in the legal community and jurists who are either, remember because November is coming around, they are either elected by all of us going to the polls, or they're either appointed. Who are they appointed by? Either the governor of your state or the president of the United States. So there's nothing political about that, right? Right? That's who's on the bench. Okay? Do they get on the bench because of their qualifications? Yes, many of them do. But do not think for a second that not one of it is a political appointment. On every level, it is a political appointment. And that is really, really important to remember. And when you think about, and this is so true in Marty's case, and I'm going to say this one segment, I'm going to show you a video, and then I'm going to let Marty talk, and I'm going to get off. And then, and later on, if you want me to go back to the how the 440 works and things like that, I have little diagrams, and I could do more of a learning if you're interested in the actual way in which this gets through the court system. But besides the political aspect, the ego, human nature. Police officers have a job. Detectives have a job. They take it's a very important job. They are cloaked in the legal system. In civil rights litigation, 1983 civil rights litigation gives officers immunity. It's called either qualified immunity. Sometimes, judges and prosecutors get what's called absolute immunity. And why are they cloaked with immunity? What does immunity mean? Immunity is a defense to say, hey, I was doing my job, and I had probable cause, so you can't sue me for a civil rights violation. Why did the Civil Rights Act allow that? Because I have many clients who come to me very often, and I say, well, she said you did this, the police had probable cause, I'm sorry, I can't bring this lawsuit for you. Well, and they're very upset by that, and I get that, because travesties and injustices go on all the time. So just to let you, the bigger picture is that our laws are not based on individual cases, right? So we throw out a large net when we legislate and have laws, because you can't legislate over every single particular situation that's going to come about, which is why we have a good system. We need the system to get better, but it's definitely better than the alternative, and that is true. And in the case of immunity and giving officers immunity, as a society as a whole, we would like law enforcement to do the job of enforcing the laws for all of us. So we do, still call ourselves a civilized society, and we are relatively speaking, a civilized society for everything that's wrong with it. And so we would like law enforcement to be in the business of enforcing the law. If every time a cop thought that, when they said, hey, that's the lady who stole my bag, or go chase her, and if every time the cop looked over his shoulder and said, shit, am I gonna get sued right now because I'm doing something wrong by going to chase? We don't want them to be thinking about that. So that's why the law gives them immunity. It doesn't give them complete immunity or absolute immunity, but it does give some type of immunity that if they were acting in their role as law enforcement officials and they did have probable cause, then in fact, they do get immunity. Now there are issues that arise, whether or not they lied, there's deceit, there's malice. The Supreme Court recently, bad court, has written some horrible decisions in the past few years about allowing immunity to exist when a witness goes and lies in the grand jury. Believe it or not, it's a shock. But and why do they say that? They say, well, it's up to the district attorney, because the district attorney puts the witnesses into the grand jury. So that's why. So in other words, you can't blame the witness or the cop who lied. And then the prosecutors have absolute immunity for acting in their role as prosecutors. But if a prosecutor does an investigation and lies in the investigation or withholds evidence, those are all grounds for civil rights violations. That's kind of a big mouthful there. Sorry. And that wasn't the little bit what I was going to talk about. What I was really getting at was the detectives and cops who have their egos and they dig their feet into, I know, don't mess with my investigation. I did the work, I did the research, I gathered the evidence, and this is it. And that was really the travesty that started the Marty Tankleff case. These cops, they didn't do the research, they didn't do the evidence, they didn't do anything. They just said, oh, it had to be him. He's the guy. There were 3 people in the house. 2 of them were dead, his parents, and Marty. 17-year-old kid just about to start his last day of senior year of high school. It's just about to start his first day of his last year of high school. And this is this kid who finds his parents dead, has no idea, is in complete shock. And these detectives just literally railed over him. And once they were entrenched in what they said, this is what happened. Do not question our authority. And this happens every day. The cops, the detectives, I know my business. And it's not just in law enforcement. I mean, I find it everywhere I am. I mean, there are lawyers, there are judges, there are, the guy who's delivering, your furniture. I know my job. I mean, I moved last year, and I'm sitting there with these guys moving. They're like, we know how to do it. We know how to do it, ma'am. Meanwhile, like 3 hours into it, I'm like, all right, you guys are bozos. Get out of the way. This is how you do it. But because people just like to say, this is how this is my job. Don't mess with my job. And that's what it is. And especially when detectives and cops get challenged by defense attorneys every day and in courts of law. And these cops are, in his case, it is horrendous what happened. And so this is one video showing it's not only the ego, it's the brazen, disgusting disregard for human and existence and moral, certainty. So let me see if I could get this video on here. Firefox, right? Okay. Yeah, I got it.
How soon did you really start suspecting Marty killed his parents? You got there around 7:30, 7:40. When did you start thinking, hey, I think this kid was involved?
Well, probably within the hour.
Within an hour. Within an hour, you know this guy has killed his parents.
Well, I really believe that he did, based on what he's told.
It's the detective in Marty's case,
And,
within an
But
hour.
that's before you've done any forensic evidence or anything.
That's correct, but the first 72 hours of any murder investigation are very critical.
We're talking about the first hour.
I know.
But you made the decision to take him to the police station, right?
Yes.
Why? Why is that important to get him to the police station?
Well, first of all, it's not a good atmosphere to interview somebody at a scene like that. We just wanted to get him into an area where the atmosphere is more appropriate for interviewing somebody.
But did Marty ever say, you're right, you got me, I did it?
He
Didn't really do that, did he?
Well, he did to a certain extent.
Yeah, but he didn't. When people think of a confession, they think, yeah, all right, you got me, you're right, I did it. Marty never did
A
that.
lot of times, in many confessions, you never get 100% of the truth out of a defendant anyway. What happens is they try to minimize their involvement.
Why didn't you tape this confession?
We don't tape confessions, or we didn't then anyway. It puts people on the gun, makes them a little more nervous than they normally would be. When they know that every single word is being recorded, and then sometimes it inhibits me as an investigator too, because I have to be extremely cautious of the words I use and say.
If Arlene fought off her attacker, as you said,
Right.
how do you explain that Marty had no injuries?
doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to have injuries.
Was there any of his tissue under her nails?
I don't recall right now.
In fact, there was no evidence of Marty on her body, was there?
I don't recall.
No, there's no hair, no tissue, nothing from Marty on her body. Nor on Seymour's.
Why would there? Why would there
If
be?
she's fighting with him, and she lost her nails, it would be his skin. He would have injuries, wouldn't
Not
he?
necessarily.
So he would have no injuries, even though she fought for her
I
life.
didn't say that. I said not necessarily.
But he had no injuries, right? He had
Marty?
no
No,
injuries.
he had no injuries.
He had no injuries. If Marty wanted to kill his dad,
Right.
why would he call 911 when his dad was still alive?
I don't think he knew his father was still alive.
He could hear him gasping. He said that.
His father was brain dead.
But he didn't know that. He
I
could
know-
hear his father
I
gasping.
know that.
Why would he call 911 if he wanted to kill his dad?
You'd have to ask Marty that.
You were talking to him just the way you were talking to me right now.
Pretty much so, yes.
You never raised your voice.
No, I might have raised my voice.
Like how? Like, give me an idea. I mean, what's the
I
worst
might
to
have said
get?
something like that. Come on, Marty, who are you kidding here? Something like that.
Do you think you've ever had a false confession?
No,
Never.
no,
How do you know?
no. Because I don't. If I'd had one, I'd know about it by now, wouldn't
And you're sure this one isn't?
I? I'm positive that one isn't.
How do you know Joe Creedon wasn't involved? He's bragged. He's told people he was involved.
No, what a lot of people do.
Just so you guys will know, Joseph Creedon, Jerry Stewman was my father's business partner who owed my father about $500,000. His son Todd Stewman was a drug dealer, and Joseph Creedon was one of his enforcers who would collect money and commit violent acts. So it's very important to understand, what I'm going to say later, is what McCready is saying right now.
Also notice how he's defendants, they, as if every single defendant, right, they're all like one class, one group, all with the same mind, right, they, and she really does an amazing job, and how he would know. How would he know? And also what's very important for Marty's, probably, I assume what you're going to talk about later, is how he talks about how, why would he call 911 if his father was in the condition he was in? The only thing that could be called a confession was as a result of the detectives lying, telling this young, shocked, frail individual that his father, lying, saying that his father had awoken and had said that Marty did it. Now, Marty had a wonderful relationship with his parents and with his father, and he looked up to his father, and his father was his mentor, and both his parents were. He could talk about both his parents were his mentor. And so the fact of hearing, my father said that, like, maybe I blacked out. That's the confession, the so-called confession. So.
And when McCready talks about that they didn't record confessions, I didn't bring my PowerPoint today, but I actually sent it to you. They actually had a policy procedure in place in 1988. They had videotaping interrogation policies, they had homicide investigations, they had the equipment, they had the technology, they had the policy procedures. They chose not to record the interrogation. And I've said this in every single case when there isn't an interrogation that's recorded, it's because they don't want the truth to come out. If we record every aspect of an interview and interrogation, the truth comes out and enables everyone to review it. When you withhold that recording or you don't record it, okay, or you don't record it till, let's say, 10 hours into the interrogation, and you that last 10 minutes were like, well, he confessed. Well, what led up to that confession? Where the 10 hours? Well, how come you didn't film those 10 hours? It's not our policy. No, you chose not to.
Such as people like him, they do shoot their mouth off like that and say things that, just to get their 15 minutes of...
How do you know that? Did you ever investigate Joe Creedon, make sure where he was that night?
Did I personally investigate
Yeah.
him? No, but he was investigated by the squad, by 6 people in my team.
And
So he was never considered a suspect in this case.
what if it turns out, in fact, that Joe Creedon, Joey Guns, was involved?
What if it happens?
Yeah.
I guess I'll look foolish, but I don't think so. I don't think it's going to happen.
Are you proud of the work you did in this case?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Would you have done anything differently?
No, I don't think so. Given the same set of circumstances, I don't see anything that I would have done differently.
So what I was talking about in terms of the brazen attitude, nothing reflects it better than Erin did, and I do have to say that so often not only do I rely on, but I just love the investigative reporters and journalists because they really do their research so thoroughly, and they have the advantage, if you will, although I'm not making it as if it's an excuse for their hard work and intelligence and their ability to just, dig deep and be tenacious. But they focus on one case, and they could really dig into one case and do incredible jobs.
So I presume by this you get a little bit of a background. So 1988 was my first day of senior year. But before we get to that day, I kind of have to give you a little bit of background of the individuals involved so you can get a better picture of why things happened, who they are. So in the early 1980s, my father invested in Jerry Stuerman, who was the bagel king of Long Island. He invested probably close to $500,000 with him. The bagel stores turned into bagel stores, horses, some other business ventures. In the summer of 1988, the business relationship and the personal relationship deteriorated completely. My father started to demand money back. And a few weeks before September 7th, my father went out golfing with my uncle Mike Fox. And Mike Fox was the family attorney, he was a family friend. And Mike said to my father, aren't you a little bit worried about Jerry? And my dad said, I'm not worried, I know where the bones are buried. And at that point, I don't think anybody really understood what that meant. Then I found out years later, after the attacks happened, that Jerry Stuerman threatened to cut my mother's tongue out. Okay? So Jerry Stuerman's son, Todd, was a drug dealer, okay, who dealt with cocaine, cocaine, pot, other drugs. He had enforcers. One of them was named by Joseph Creedon. Joseph Creedon was an enforcer who used violent acts to extort money. He was convicted of rape. He fully admitted some of this on this witness stand. Now, when McCready talks about up there that he was investigated by his team, he wasn't. McCready is a liar. He's been found to have committed perjury before, and he continued committing perjury throughout this case. So imagine September 7th, 1988, your first day of senior year. You should wake up and have this joyous first day. Should be. The night before, my father held a high-stakes poker game because he was a regular card player, and one of the members at the game was Jerry Stuerman. Now, some would say, if my father felt so fearful of Jerry Stuerman, why would he allow him into the house? My father was this guy who grew up in Brooklyn, tough guy, nobody was going to stop him, nobody was going to intimidate him. And the card game was a regular occurrence. Okay, and there was always people there. We later learned, at the end of the night, Jerry Stuerman should have been like the second or third person to leave last. He wasn't. So the following morning, I wake up, I find my father clinging to life, and my mother deceased. I was questioned by police at length. Everyone, including myself, when we were asked, who do you think was involved in this, we all said Jerry Stuerman. Why? He owed my father over $500,000. Now, if you think police...
Stop for 1 second, because you leave this part out. From the moment when Marty woke up until he discovered his parents, and then he called 911, he was taken into custody by the police at his home that morning. And he was taken into police custody. He was taken back to Yaphank, where he was then questioned repeatedly for hours.
And it was also,
he was never released. He never had any family. His
my brother-in-law was separated from me.
brother-in-law was trying to get to him.
And when Mike Fox showed up at the house, Because at one point, Mike Fox was the family attorney and my godfather. He was told Marty's at the house. He comes to the house to get me. Who do you think stopped Mike Fox from knowing I was there? Come on, McCready. McCready ran up to him and said, Marty's not here. Mike told him, I represent the family attorney. I don't want him questioned. I want him brought to the house. McCready said, he's not here. He's on the way to the hospital. It was a lie.
It was a lie.
It was a lie. And at a later point, okay, McCready had said to one of the lawyers, Mike never said the magic words. He never said he was a criminal lawyer. And Amy can tell you, and I can tell you, it doesn't matter what kind of lawyer you are. You could do real estate, you could do transactional, you could do estates, it doesn't matter. If I'm a lawyer and I say I represent the professor here, you can't talk to him.
On this matter, the
On this
law
matter.
in New York is not great, but the
Yeah.
law requires you to say, I'm counsel, but you also have to say, I'm counsel on this matter. So I have clients who I represented on a matter. The matter was over a month before. My client gets rearrested. I call the priest. My client says, Ms. Marion represents me. They do a search. She hasn't represented. Nobody's put in a notice of appearance. Nobody's informed us that she represents you on this present matter. So, but Mike Fox was there and said, I'm the family attorney and I'm representing him. And just to let you know, the law in 1988 was not like that. You came in and you said, I'm the lawyer. It's your constitutional right to counsel. It's invoked and that's it. All questioning stops. That didn't, not only did that not happen, but I believe he was still at the scene in the back of a car, like they literally shushed him away so that Mike couldn't see him.
Imagine, let's say that door is a driveway. I was all the way over here in a car, so somebody pulled up over there, and McCready saw him pulling up, and I kind of said at one point, oh, there's my Uncle Mike, so I recognized the car. So McCready did one of these, jetted right towards the car, stopped him. Okay? McCready knew what he was doing because McCready and the crews out there had this pattern where they would isolate suspects that they wanted to interrogate and they wanted to get confessions out. Okay, they did in the James Pius case where they're moving people around. And the Diaz.
So explain a little bit of those, what this crew is up to.
So
Also remember it was the late 80s. There was a lot of like coke and drugs. And these detectives, some of them, there are allegations from people out there that were very good about, one of them owned a bar, and so there was a lot of partying going on, and there were drug dealers that they allowed. So this was not, these guys weren't so squeaky.
In 1988,
Allegedly.
In 1988, this is not allegedly, in 1988, the State of New York Commission of Investigation issued about a 200-page report about the misconduct of the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, the police department, the detectives. In that report, the commission found McCready had committed perjury in another homicide case. They also found that there were illegal wiretaps going on, but this is the kind of the nature out there. I think it was 1984, the American Bar Association found that the Suffolk County Homicide Squad used very unorthodox tactics because they got anywhere from 90 to 98% confessions in their homicide cases, which was higher than anywhere in the country. It's kind of unheard of. I could tell you that the various tactics I heard over the years that they used physical violence, they used mental coercion. They would take telephone books, put the telephone books on, you hit you with the metal pipe so the pipe wouldn't leave a bruise, but you felt the pain. One of the common tactics that homicide detectives use is the isolation, the lies, the deceits. I mean, I can go into a long method, but maybe another time there's the read technique, where it's interrogations where they try to get you comfortable, and they ended up having you believe that the only way out of the interrogation room is to confess or acknowledge what they want you to say.
And the only way the investigation by the state came about, because it wouldn't come about from defense attorneys or from, actual innocent individuals complaining, it was because a judge actually was in the middle of a trial, and during the middle of the trial, the judge caught the detective lying right next to him testifying. Was it the suppression hearing or the trial? I think it was the suppression hearing.
I think it was a suppression.
Suppression hearing. And so it was a hearing to suppress, it was actually to suppress identification testimony, if I recall. It was a show-up testimony from those witnesses. So it was only because this judge, Judge Nam, who was a politically appointed judge, and who said that I was, as he said, I was a part of that. I was a part of that political community out there. And he said to me, I mean, it ruined his life from doing this, but he did this. Years later, he's kind of, whether or not he actually appreciates it or not, because he really does feel like how, the personal cost, but it was a very important thing what he did. And he reported these lies and perjurious testimony, which led to New York State starting the investigation. And don't forget that Suffolk County still, if you recall, right, just recently Trump out there, and that was in Brentwood, and that was in front of Suffolk County cops. And there was a study done by the Southern Poverty Law Secretary with regard to the profiling of the Hispanic community in Suffolk County. Because of the studies done by the Suffolk County, the Southern Poverty Law Center, that went to the DOJ, the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice issued a scathing report years ago to Suffolk County that said, you need to change all of your policies, your practices, your guidelines in Suffolk County. Has it been done? No, because what happened 2 years ago was one of our client, my partner Bruce Barket and myself, one of our clients, Christopher Loeb, was beaten by the chief of police, Chief Burke, who was the chief of police for Suffolk County Police Department, who's now in federal prison so he was the chief of police. So what happens? The DOJ says something, New York State, commission says something, and they're still, with all that power, and it takes the chief of police to be incarcerated. But has that stopped the policies? No, because the DA is still the DA out there.
So back to September 7th, I'm brought to headquarters, and when McCready talked about how they didn't record interrogations, they chose not to. So after being there for God knows how many hours, 6 or 7 hours, I was finally, the police turned around and said, Marty confessed. Now, there's no videotape of it, there's no recording of it, but let me try to explain how false confessions come about, and I kind of have to simplify it because people find it very difficult to understand. How many people in here have siblings? How many people remember when you were very young, your parents went out, somebody broke a lamp in the house, and your parents come home, and they said, okay, who broke the lamp? We're not going out for ice cream until we find out who broke the lamp. How many of you who didn't broke the lamp said, okay, I broke it just to go out for ice cream? Yeah, you confessed. Okay, it's that simple. When people need to understand that if you think about it in the most simplistic terms, you just want to go out for ice cream. Now imagine being locked in a room and you're there for 6, 7, 8, 10 hours. You've got nowhere to go, and all the cops keep telling you, you're not going anywhere, so you tell us what we want to hear. After a while, you're just going to give in because you have, especially if you're innocent, you have the mistaken belief that whatever you say will be proven to be not true. Saul Casson told me, it was at a presentation where he told me a story about a bald suspect who was being interrogated. The cop said, we have your hair at the crime scene, just confess. He said, okay, I was there. He's thinking, I'm bald. Well, my hair could have been there. He confessed. Did he get charged? And confessions...
Trust law enforcement.
Okay, trust law enforcement. And confessions are, depending on where you are, it's the king of all evidence. Because when people hear someone confessed, okay, I mean, nowadays it's a little bit different, but you think back to 1990, okay? If I told you somebody confessed to a crime when probably half the room wasn't even born, you said, if you confessed, you probably did it. Okay? But it's not true, and we have proven through DNA evidence, we've proven through the evaluation of videotaped evidence, and most of you will know the Central Park jogger case. Okay? We've all know this case. I've testified with Yusuf, I've testified with Raymond before. They were lucky enough to have videotapes, as strange as it sounds, lucky, I use the word lucky, that their confessions were videotaped. So when all of a sudden, years later, the DNA evidence came out to show they weren't guilty, people were able to go back and go, how did this come about? In some of those cases, the parents were there. That is the benefit of having videotaped interrogations. So here I am, September 7th, and I finally get out of the confines of the police. And one of the first people I spoke to was my half-sister, Shari, who said, "Did you confess?" I said, "They made me tell them things." So here I am, I'm charged with the murder of my mother, attempted murder of my father. As my father is clinging to life, Jerry Stuerman, my father's business partner, cleans out a joint bank account, fakes his death, tells his family he's going to be swimming with the fish, flees New York, breaks off his chain, leaves his car running, goes to New Jersey, goes to California, back then he had a hair weave, so he went to a hair place, got his new hair weave put in, goes to hide out in a psychiatric retreat. How many people in this room would consider him a suspect knowing those facts? What if I told you Suffolk County didn't? He wasn't a suspect. But they sent a homicide, they sent McCready out to California to bring him back, and he was never considered a suspect. Even though his son was a drug dealer who had enforcers, who committed violent acts, even though Jerry Stuerman owed my father over $500,000, was there that night, okay? And when McCready says that they investigated Creedon,
criminal law, motive, opportunity, flight, indicia of guilt.
So in the criminal process, because the police said I confessed, we had what was called the Hunley hearing. Problem at this Hunley hearing was my defense lawyer was running for the district attorney, and the judge hearing the hearing was also in contention for running for the district attorney's position. So if you're a judge and you have this high-profile case, and you want to get the career of the favor of law enforcement, well, obviously you're not going to rule that law enforcement lied.
And a Huntley hearing is a hearing to suppress statements of the accused. And in Marty's case, there couldn't have been anything that was more important. And as in many cases, if you suppress the evidence, then there's no case left. In his case, the only evidence was this so-called confession. So it was the most important part of his case.
And the confession, as interesting would be, is that if you broke it down fact by fact, the way law enforcement said I confessed, every single thing was wrong. They said that there was a knife that was next to a piece of watermelon in my house was the murder weapon. Lo and behold, it was watermelon on the knife, nothing more than that. In 1988, we recently found out through civil discovery, the medical examiner told the DA's office the watermelon knife was not and could not have been the murder weapon. Unfortunately, they led the public to believe the watermelon knife was a murder weapon. They led the jury to believe it. They lied. Okay? In this quote-unquote confession, they said a dumbbell was used. The dumbbell was microscopically inspected. There was no evidence of this. Years later, 2004, 2005, 2006, the Attorney General's office got involved and they conducted some reinvestigations. And they found evidence that had been withheld for almost 25 years. I'll get to that later, but I just want to, so you understand kind of the mentality out there. So the confession, so-called confession, the statement, Judge Tisch allowed it in. 1990, I was tried and convicted after a 12-week trial. Now, up until this point, district attorney kept saying it was the most difficult case they've ever had to try because I was going to play the video.
Oh, I know. I'm just gonna put up a picture.
Oh, okay. It was the most difficult case they ever had to try because the victim's family and defendant's family were the same family. And what was interesting about this, everybody said, if that's your feeling, aren't you missing something?
I just wanted to put up the picture of when you were 17.
Oh. That could have been sensing. That could have been.
There's a better picture. There's a younger one I like.
That could have been sensing. So, just for everyone to understand really how difficult this case was, I just want to show you a short clip of my family. So, realize this. My mother's sister supported me. My father's brother supported me. There was only one family member who didn't support me. My half-sister. My half-sister ended up benefiting financially from my conviction. And after I was found guilty and went to prison, she opened up a bar restaurant with her husband, and guess who? The detective. So not only did my half-sister benefit financially by my conviction, the lead detective benefited financially from my conviction.
Why are you here tonight?
I'm here because I believe Marty is innocent.
That's my Uncle Normie.
I feel that Marty is a very gentle
And
soul.
Ruthie.
And I held Marty when he was 1 day old. And it was just wonderful. And he grew up, he was just a lovely, lovely young man. And we have so much love for him, more than all the distorted things that are going around.
There is not one scintilla of doubt in my mind that Marty is innocent.
It would be so much easier if Marty did do it.
Those are my
Because
mother's two sisters.
We wouldn't all be here and have to, be tortured with all of this information that we're constantly getting, and it's constantly being, thrown in our faces. We could put it to rest. We could write Marty off and not have anything to do with him if we thought that he did it.
He was slight of build. Arlie would have hit him like a tennis ball. I mean, he was maybe 5'6", maybe about 120 pounds. There was no way. He was really an easygoing, quiet kid. And there was nothing wrong in that house that day, because I was there for about 3 or 4 hours. And it was the day before school.
My sister played tennis like a man, and I said she'd swing her hand and knock him into the bay. She fought, and I thought perhaps Marty had marks on him or what.
So what did you do?
So I opened his shirt.
So you went to see him in prison, jail.
And I opened his shirt, and he said, "Oh, Aunt Mickey, what are you looking for? What are you looking?" I said, "Marks." And he said...
So what she's talking about is right after I was arrested, and the first time I could get a visitor, because of what McCready had said, McCready had pulled all the family members aside, you have to come to terms, Marty's guilty. And she came to visit me, and she's opening up my shirt, rolling up my sleeves. I said, "What are you looking for?" They said, McCready said you did this, and there's marks all over you. And I go, "What are you talking about?" So that's what she's talking about when she came looking for some kind of injury.
I said, take your shirt, and he did. And he pulled up his sleeve, and he didn't have a mark on him. Not a mark on him.
We're not only here because we're thinking out of love, we're thinking with our heads, too. There is no evidence. Right. There's not any evidence to prove that he's guilty.
Can you at all imagine admitting to something you didn't do?
If a person that I respected and loved, such as my wife, said that I had committed some violence, some awful stuff, I would say to myself, holy smokes, maybe I wasn't conscious of what I did.
Maybe when you're in such a state of shock, can you imagine what that young man went through that day?
He just woke up to the worst nightmare that someone could wake up to in their lives. He administered first aid to his father. He didn't try. He administered first aid to his father. He made the calls. He waited for the police. And then when the police got there, all they did was take this kid and just railroad him. It's very strong evidence of how close Marty was with his parents and with his father. They had an amazing trust. So Marty trusts his dad so much that if his dad said this, then it has to be true.
What was your reaction when you realized he was convicted?
Oh, terrible, terrible. I could never believe it in a million years. I kept saying to myself, why did we leave him there? Why didn't we take him out of that house and not let the police near him?
Well, we're both only children, and I learned how to swim at their house and spent summers there. And I stayed in his room when we were there that summer. He gave up his room so my stepsister and I could have it. And I just don't believe he did it. He would drop us off at school. He helped us with our school projects, and he baked brownies, and he knew our friends, and he just became part of our family.
How would you describe him?
He's probably one of the strongest people I know. I don't know how he lives every day and how he survives, and he makes everybody else strong with his strength. It's amazing. He has so much spirit and hope, and I think that's what gets us all through it.
We've seen him sob and sob and sob, and we saw him sob on and off through the trial. But then when he gets in front of, where he's supposed to maintain some dignity, that's exactly what he does. And his attorney told all of us not to show any emotion.
Right. It was such a warm relationship, and Marty loved family so much that anytime I invited Seymour and Arlene over, or even if they just dropped by, you knew Marty was going to be with them. And even as a teenager, he just loved being with family, loved being with them. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful thing to see and experience. He's a great kid.
So Marty's ability to put the emotion aside and to speak was actually one of his downfalls in the criminal trial. The criminal trial was a very, very highly publicized event out on Long Island. If you were around or of some age in Long Island in the late 80s and 88 when this was going on, you knew about it because it was on the cover of the Newsday every single day. And because Marty was able to speak in a way that the emotions didn't flood through, it was deemed that he was cold. And that's how it was portrayed, that he was cold. You have to realize the age of this boy and how influential, not only, and his parents. He loved his parents. He idolized his parents. He grew up in a beautiful, home with his parents. And his dad was a strong guy, a business guy, a tough guy. So you have all of that. You have him being swept away. You have the shock. And there is science, unlike the science that I told you that's not science. There is science by scientist Dr. John Ewell, who's one of the leading scientists in the United States, in the world actually, who developed all of New York City. It's called the Child Advocacy Centers. John Ewell created the Child Advocacy Centers in New York. Child Advocacy Centers are developed so that there would be a three-pronged process of the DA's office, the police, and social workers to talk to children, child victims. And the science that developed by John Ewell and many other practitioners throughout the country deals with memory changing. And they have tests and scientific studies that have been done that memories can be changed. Memories are changed. If you've ever had kids and your kids are young, and you could tell, my son's 22 now, I think I could probably tell him at 15 years old this happened, and he would say, oh, okay. And so it's very easy actually to change memories. The other thing that you realize when you deal with witnesses a lot is that people don't think or believe that they're lying, but they believe in a story that they now have created or that their memory was changed to believe. So that is how, when we think about false confessions and what people say, how could somebody confess if they didn't do it? How can somebody confess if they didn't do it? If somebody tells you that something happened, and Marty was in such a shocked state, and then he was told by the detectives that his father, who he loved dearly, is clinging on to life and has awoken and stated that you did that, who knows what would have come out of his mouth at that time. He can't talk about it. Not I won't say downplay, but you need to understand that with his mother, his mother fought fiercely. This was a vicious attack. There was blood on the wall. There were the curtains strewn down. That it was a horrible, she was beaten to death. Blunt trauma. Real force. This was a horrible homicide. This was in a house in the 80s. There was white carpet everywhere. There was not a drop of blood anywhere on the white carpet. There was not any physical evidence on Marty whatsoever. There was nothing. He had a little blood because he went over and was trying to save his father. Your father?
I gave first aid to my father, so I had some blood on him.
Right.
But Amy is right. I mean, my original defense lawyer, one of the first things he said, he goes, wait a minute, he goes, your mother was attacked in the bedroom, your father was on the opposite end of the house. If you did this, you're going to be, if you'd be walking from one end of the house to the next, white carpets, white floors, black, there'd be some trace evidence. And there was
It wasn't.
nothing.
And the prosecution's theory of the case was that, well, he went and he washed it all off. Well, yeah, right, good, that quick, good. He wasn't wet. But then what the defense did was the defense actually went and had a plumber, and they took out everything from the drains. There was not one bit of DNA, no evidence, no blood, no nothing. Nothing found. They searched that entire property for a weapon. There was no weapon found. Years later, through the DNA on the sheets, they were actually able to see an imprint of a weapon that was actually the real weapon that was taken from the scene.
That what Amy's talking about is on the comforter of my mother's room, my parents' room, they found a bloody knife imprint on the comforter. The comforter had been in possession of the Suffolk County Police Department from day one. They never disclosed anything about that imprint. It wasn't until almost 20 years later when the Attorney General conducted their reinvestigation, they uncovered and they disclosed it. Additionally, there were glove-like prints in blood in my house, but they never found the gloves. And years later, okay, when I start talking about the individuals up on the board, okay, they identified they were wearing gloves. So I'm going to fast forward 1990. I was tried.
I just want to say one other thing about the physical, about the evidence, just to show the overwhelming evidence of innocence, was that there was also aerodynamics studies done by individuals who do like airplane noise sound. And so where Marty's room was in a part of the house, and Marty had this, like, his bed was in underneath a loft. It was cave-like, as they said, and that's how the structure was. And it was a cave-like structure where his room and his bed was. And they actually did studies with the individuals who do, airplane to see the sound and see if the sound is too loud. And they did studies to see what you could hear from outside of that room where his bed was located under this sort of, I picture it as sort of a little bit of a cement dome, the way the walls are, and they said it was cave-like. And so they did noise studies to hear, because if there was such a struggle with his mother, the other question was, why didn't he wake up, right? So if a heavy sleeper or not in that house. And they actually did studies, and the studies showed that when you were in the air, when you were sleeping where his bed was, you could not hear any noise from outside there.
It even goes further than that. The woman who worked for NASA, and the study is that she lay in my bed awake, and they had people throughout the house screaming and yelling at louder voices, and it was like almost a 0 decibel registration in the room. But some people say, well, why was Marty left alive? Who else to take the fall? Because if I was killed, who do you think they'd go after? McCready. And as we've later learned, Stewart. Well, McCready too. Okay, because that morning, McCready was not the homicide detective on duty. Someone else was. Somehow he showed up before the homicide detective on duty arrived. He was in a suit and tie, and he knew facts about the case that he shouldn't have known. I'll just give you one example. He knew there was a card game there that took place the night before. How would he know that unless he knew maybe in advance what was going to happen? Because as we later learned during the 440 hearings, McCready and Stuerman knew each other.
And he was not dressed in a suit and tie. He was working on his projects of building real estate condos or something. He was like a GC on some job. So he had to go home, get in his suit, and get to the scene.
So 1990, found guilty. And all the evidence that comes out, everybody's saying, how is he found guilty? There's nothing there. I was sentenced to 50 years to life. First appeal, as Amy talked earlier, was a direct appeal in 1993. In New York State, the Appellate Division Second Department, you argue before 4 judges. My Uncle Mike in California asked my appellate lawyer, said, what happens if it goes 2-2? And the lawyer said, never goes 2-2. What do you think happened in my case? 2-2. A 5th judge was brought on, unbeknownst to anybody, and they ruled against me 3-2. I had 2 judges in 1993 vote to dismiss the indictments against me and set me free. Unfortunately, the New York system doesn't work well. We appealed to the next highest court, which was the Court of Appeals. That court ruled 7-0. From there, you go to the Federal District Court. They ruled against me. From there, we went up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals issued a very, if anybody goes on to law school, it's a very interesting case to study, because in federal courts, they can only grant relief under federal law. The Second Circuit went beyond their normal kind of sense and said, under state constitutional law, your rights were violated. The state courts have ruled erroneously, but we can't grant you relief under that. But there was a Batson violation. Batson is a jury selection issue where the prosecutor uses exclusions to get rid of minorities. Minorities, I think it's race, religion, I think it's even
The suspect class.
Suspect class. Now, in 1988, I was white, and the jurors that the prosecutor was getting rid of were African American. Now, back in 88, it really wasn't an issue, but my defense lawyer said, every African American juror that's coming forward here, the prosecutor is getting rid of. And years later, the courts agreed with my defense lawyer. So the Second Circuit said, you have to go back down for a hearing to assess the credibility of the prosecutor's reasons for excluding the jurors. So we go back down to, unfortunately, Suffolk County. The case is being heard before a judge whose daughter works in the DA's office that is fighting to keep me in prison. The daughter's boss is my prosecutor. The judge doesn't disclose this fact. The prosecutor's office doesn't disclose this fact. And the sole responsibility of the judge was to assess the credibility of his daughter's boss and why he excluded jurors. We didn't find out about these relations until about 6 months later after the judge had already ruled against me. And we asked for a new hearing. They said no. So it was right about this time that my new lawyers said, what has never been done before? And that's an investigation. So in 1998, 1999, I started looking for private investigators. I found one by the name of J. Salpeter. Jay started what no one else had done. He said, okay, who benefited financially in this case? Stuerman. Who had drug dealing associates? Todd Stuerman. So he started with Jerry Stuerman, went down to Todd Stuerman. He started looking at criminal associates. One of the first criminal associates he found was Glenn Harris. When he went to Glenn Harris said, I've been waiting, I think, 13 years for this day. And Jay said, what do you mean? He goes, I was the getaway driver that night. He said, I brought Peter Kent and Joe Graydon. Peter Kent and Joey Creed into the house. They committed the murders. So with that start of a small body of new evidence, we started conducting additional investigations, and we found all these other witnesses where Stuerman had gone to people to take a contract out to kill my parents. And one of the individuals was, I think, Joe Graydon. Joe Graydon passed it on to Joseph Creedon, Brian Scott Glass, okay? And I can actually, this is on the website, so if anybody wants to know the details of this. So all of a sudden we developed this body of evidence that shows I was innocent again. And we brought it to the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office and said, listen, we're going to give you 45 days to conduct your own investigation into what we've developed, because guess what? We don't have the same investigatory powers that you do. We don't have the same subpoena power that you do. Well, they didn't go out to investigate the first witness till the 44th day, I think. Now, I need to backtrack for one moment. Before my first appeal was heard in 1993, there was a woman by the name of Carlene Kovacs on the right-hand side. She was at a party where Joseph Creedon, one of the murderers, confessed to her in 1992 or 93. We brought that information to the DA's office. They did nothing with it. Nothing. So after we've developed this body of evidence, we want to continue to investigate. So one of the ideas that my private investigator had said, let's polygraph Marty. Let's polygraph Glenn Harris, who's the getaway driver. Let's polygraph Carlene Kovacs just to see, is everyone telling the truth? We used a gentleman by the name of Joel Reicheter, who works at the Department of Defense. He's also the gentleman who trained Robert De Niro in Meet the Fockers. I think it was De Niro, right? Everyone passed with flying colors. So we developed this body of evidence. We presented it in Suffolk County, and the hearings go on for about 18 months. Because at one point, there was a gentleman by the name of, I think, Joseph Graydon, who said that there were some conflicts. So we had to file a motion for special conflicts. Eventually, the hearing continued, and in January of 2007, a gentleman by the name of, where is it? John Garasio. Can anybody read who John Garasio is? Okay. John Garasio is Joseph Creedon's son. So the individual that is publicly being identified as the murderer, his son was our last witness who said, my father confessed to me that he committed the murders and it wasn't Marty. You would think in a normal, just criminal justice system, the judge would say, enough's enough. Now, some of these witnesses included Father Ronald, a priest, a nun, where the getaway driver confessed to them. Unfortunately, the judge ruled against me, said a lot of the witnesses we presented were nefarious scoundrels. So the nefarious scoundrels included family members, friends, a nun, a priest, a businessman, expert witnesses. So we ended up having to appeal.
People you saw, right? Aunt Ruthie.
Yeah. Okay. And it got so bad at one point, the prosecutor accused my defense team of paying witnesses off to testify. And he publicly came out and said that. And when we went into court, we said, what are you talking about? He says, well, you pay them for their lost wages and their travel expenses, which Amy can tell you and I can tell you, it is absolutely legal. If somebody flies up from Florida and they're spending 3 days from work, you can pay them for their lost wages. But it turned into they're paying witnesses to testify. Then the prosecutor would say, people are trying to get their 15 minutes of fame. How many in this room would want to inject themselves into a double homicide case just to be on TV to say, well, somebody confessed to me 15 years ago? Nobody. People want to go on with their lives. So finally, the judge rules against me. We appealed to the appellate division, and it was October of 2007. I think you were there. I don't know if you were there. It was 4 different lawyers that argued my case. I had 4 separate types of appeals. The courtroom was so packed, you've probably heard the story before, was so packed that they actually had an overflow room. One of the big supporters was Barry Scheck. James Gandolfini was also there. Aaron Moriarty was there. My family was there. And it was on December 21st, it was the last day of 2007, that the court could issue their rulings. And I remember I was in Comstock Correctional Facility, and I worked in the law library, and we had access to the phones. And I think you've heard the story before. And I remember calling in the morning, I'm calling around, like, still no decision, still no decision. And so I'm like, oh shit, what the hell's gonna happen now? You know, it's the last day, like, am I gonna be still stuck here? Go back for lunch, come back, get on the phone in the afternoon, and I speak to Roz Dan. Roz was somebody who worked with Lonnie Sori, who did some of the public relations, advocacy, and she's like, we won. And I said, what the fuck did we win? because I had 4 appeals and I had a DNA thing, and I'm thinking, what did we win? She's like, I don't know. And finally, I ended up calling Lenska. And she's like, you won the big one. I go, what does that mean? She goes, I don't know. So everybody I'm calling, I'm like, okay, we won. And it was every person I called, you could hear the joy in their voices because they knew we won something. And by this point, I'd also worked in the law library for almost 13 or 14 years, and I finally got to speak to Bruce. And his famous phrase with me is like, pack your shit, you're coming home. You will never see the inside of a jail cell. And I said to him, I said, Bruce, I said, I know enough about the law. It's an oral contract. I'm going to hold you to it. And if you don't live up to it, I'm going to come after you. He goes, you're never going back. And that was Friday, December 21st, 2007. I'll never forget it. Because I can remember walking through the jail, and by the time I got back to the cell block, the entire jail knew about this. Because I don't even know how they knew about it, but they knew. And I remember later on in the day, I spoke to one of my lawyers who did the main argument. And he was on a train ride up to New York, and he said, Marty, he goes, I actually had a dream last Friday that you were going to get a favorable decision today. I said, come on, Steve. He goes, no, I'm serious. And Bruce, I think, worked out what they called like a paper bail. And the DA, the guy who tried to keep me in jail all this time, said, it's going to take months to get Marty down. And Bruce said, well, do you mind if I call the sheriff up so we can kind of speed this along? Bruce like, do whatever you want to do. Bruce spoke to Sheriff Vincent DeMarco, and Vincent said, get me a quarter, I'll get him down as quickly as possible. I was brought down the day after Christmas, and cameras were everywhere, and December 27, 2007, I was released. And you can go back and watch some of the videos, but there's some things you don't see because I was originally supposed to go back to the jail to get released. But Bruce had such a good relationship with the court staff there, and they believed in me, and they wanted to get me out as quickly as possible. I went out the back door of the sheriff's custody. And I remember coming out the back door, and there's helicopters flying over, and there's just crowds of people. And like, there's only one thing, Marty, we have to go back into the courthouse. I'm like, why? I just got released. And I remember everybody was walking quickly, and I said, can we just slow it down? They're like, why? Are you okay? I'm like, it's my first steps of freedom. Let me enjoy this. So I ended up having to go back into the courthouse, said whatever I had to say, and it was actually a funny thing happened afterwards. Because of the amount of people there, they had bodyguards or goons that took me out, and little did I know, I didn't know what cell phones were really, everybody had their cell phones on silent, because we're in the courthouse. So when I left, they were trying to get a hold of the 2 guys that got me, because here I'm out on $1 million bail, and Marty's gone, nobody could find Marty. And it wasn't until we got to the gas station that everybody said, we got to turn our cell phones on. So that day we went back to my family's house, and if you want to talk about food, they had food catered from one of my favorite restaurants from when I was a kid. And the media stalked me. So every time I came out of my family's house, they stalked me. So my family had a house in Pennsylvania, and I had family flying from California, my Aunt Marianne, my Uncle Mike, my cousin Jenny. And the interesting thing is we had to play this kind of cat and mouse game with the press because we wanted some privacy time. Here I was, 6,338 days in prison. I'm free. Like, I want to get away from everybody. So the press were camped out front. My family packs their car up. I go out the front door. I'm like, bye. They drive away. I go out the back door of the house, through the woods, over the fence to a parking lot. My family's around there. I drive away. We're in Pennsylvania. We called the press, said, Marty's not home. They said, yes, he is. He's home. We've been watching the house. I said, you didn't watch the back of the house. So, and there's some great times because I remember it was New Year's. When I went away, I went skiing, went eating, and I didn't care how many times I fell. Like here I was up on Elk Mountain in Pennsylvania, okay, and somebody said, when's the last time you skied? I go, 17 and a half years ago. They said, you were? I'm like, what's the worst could happen? I break my leg, I'm free. No big deal. So since then, about 3 weeks after that, I enrolled at Hofstra University. I started my bachelor's degree. In January of 2009, I did a semester abroad in Venice, Italy, as part of the Hofstra program, which really was funny because I couldn't get a passport because the passport agency kept thinking I had a criminal conviction, and we had to fight to get that all cleared up. And one of the best lines that some of the defense team said, look what a year makes. A year ago, we were fighting to get him out of prison from doing 50 years to life, and a year later we're trying to get him out of the country. And I remember when I was over in Venice, there was an older student there, he was about 25. He said, you know, Marty, he said, what made you decide to go to college later on in life? He's like, did you run out of money or something? Here I was, 37, twice your age. I said, yeah, something like that, Mark. And it was about 6 months later, I was on the Oprah show, and he saw it, and he goes, now I get why you went to school later on in life. But since then, I completed my bachelor's degree. I went on to law school. I've taken the UBE. Now it's not even the bar anymore. It's the UBE. I'm waiting for admission in 3 different jurisdictions. I've spoken in your class 3 times now. I've testified before the NYPD, the New York State Assembly. I'm a big proponent that no matter what struggles you've been through, you can overcome too. And if you encounter exonerees, they are probably the least bitter and some of the most passionate and gentle people you will ever meet. Okay? Because most people say, oh, aren't you angry? Aren't you bitter? Hell yeah. But am I going to let that anger or bitter control my life? If I let the anger or bitter control my life, I'm not living. I'm letting everyone else win. I've gotten married since I've been out. I've adopted my daughter. I'm scheduled to start teaching. I'm living life, okay? I mean, was the adjustment difficult? Absolutely. You know, most people don't understand the reintegration process is a long process. You know, some people think it can happen easily. How many people in this room are 21 and under? Raise your hands. Okay. Imagine what's transpired in your entire life with just technology. So imagine you lost 21 years of your life and came out into the world that it was today. Okay? Would you know what an iPhone was? Okay? The first exposure I had to the internet was I was being held in Nassau County Jail and they had dial-up. Does anyone know what dial-up was? Okay, high-speed internet, what was that? The day I got out, they set me up with an email, they gave me a cell phone. I mean, and for me, going to college was probably one of the most difficult things I did. Because here I was 37, just served 17.5 years in prison, and I said to myself, I'm a goldfish in a sea of sharks. And I've spoken to other exonerees and they feel the same way, is because none of us were on par with all the other students as far as technology goes, social interaction. And there are some exonerees that I know today who have been out 10 years, 15 years, who still can't socialize. I was down at Georgetown University giving a lecture, and there were 4 exonerees. 3 of the exonerees went out, we all went out as a group. Me, I could talk to anybody. This other exoneree gravitates to the same type of people. And I always get the same question, how do you do it, Marty? I just do. I mean, I worked at Amy's firm. I think I got along with everybody there. I've dealt with clients before. I mean, my wife has kind of a running joke. She'll go into a room sometimes when we're at some new place and she goes, you know, there was somebody who was in this room who served almost 20 years in prison. Could you guess who it is? And when she eventually introduces me, like, that's not him. There's no way possible. And I get that all over the place. But, you know, if you want to talk about what I'm doing too, so today it's St. Francis, tomorrow's Torah Law School, Thursday and Friday is Georgetown University, Thursday night is James Madison. It's something I enjoy doing because students are really the future. And so often students say, what can we do? How can we make the system better? How can we change the system? There is so much you can do. You have social media is powerful beyond imagination. There was a case, Marcellus Williams was just facing the death penalty, and I forget what state it was. And there were some people that I knew that got involved, and they used social media to convince the governor to stop the execution. And I think back to when I was first arrested. Had there been social media, what would have happened? And if you look at a lot of the wrongful conviction cases nowadays, social media is used in almost every one of them. They create websites, they create Instagrams and Twitter accounts. It's powerful. Open it for Q&A?
We have a few minutes for Q&A. That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Marty and Amy.
I mean, I'd say
So
the
deep.
corruption, I think, I don't like to say it runs rampant. I think what ends up happening is, and I know Bruce has said this is something, there becomes these institutional blinders. And I had this conversation with somebody in law enforcement in the DA's office recently. So you have a detective who thinks he's doing the right thing. He presents what he thinks is the right evidence to a prosecutor. The problem is that the prosecutor and the detective have worked with each other for 10 years, 15 years. They have a trust with each other. The prosecutor doesn't challenge what the detective brought to him. He assumes it's the truth. That's a problem. And we've seen in Kings County, when Ken Thompson was alive, how many wrongful conviction cases arose out of Louis Scarcella. In a lot of those cases, it's probably because the prosecutors never questioned what Louis Scarcella brought. What also happens is a lot of times is, you have to realize, the prosecutor's office is the most powerful law enforcement body in every jurisdiction.
Chief Burke just got indicted 2 years ago.
I know that.
It's rampant.
I know.
Okay, he's way too nice.
I was going to let you finish. Okay? So Chief Burke was the Suffolk County police chief who actually happened to be the police chief during my reinvestigation, who worked in the DA's office. And I can go back to when in the reinvestigation on my 440, Spoda, the chief DA, had represented McCready in private practice in an assault case. So they had an attorney-client privilege, an attorney-client relationship. We said that's a clear conflict because how does the DA investigate his former client? The DA turns around and says, I'm going to appoint somebody special in this office that has no contact. It was Walter Walkenthien. Walter Walkenthien worked with McCready in the 80s. So is corruption, incestuous relationships exist? Beyond belief, okay? And what's happening now is I think social media, I think the public is demanding more. When we go out and we're walking along the streets and we're seeing police brutality, there was a few years ago where there was the bike race that came through New York City, many may remember this, where they were filming it and the police officers wrote the reports and all of a sudden the videotaped evidence came out which completely contradicted it. There was the case, I think it was in the Bronx or Brooklyn, where two brothers owned a bar and the detectives said they were dealing drugs in the bar. The detectives didn't know that the brothers had a secret videotape system in the bar. And when the video came out and showed that they weren't there, they weren't dealing drugs, all those things are starting to really expose what many of us have known, Amy probably more than anybody, she's been doing this for 30 years, there is rampant corruption, there's these incestual relationships, and people in our community have been exposed to it more than others.
It's all over the world, and people just
over.
lie. It's based on their baseism, their biases and racism, and they don't even know that they're racist or they're, I mean, just look at like Harvey Weinstein, right? I mean, all these women in Hollywood, so-called feminists, right? And nobody even spoke out when they knew that he was abusing women left and right. So people just put up with the institutionalized behavior and they just allow it to happen. But unfortunately, it's so prevalent, and prosecutors now, it's just coming to the point where the legal system and judges are coming down on prosecutors for withholding exculpatory evidence. That's evidence proving somebody's innocence. So those were issues that were very prevalent in Marty's case, right? Withholding evidence that's favorable for the defense. And it's only now, after all this time, when we knew that this was going on, and defense lawyers have been fighting about this for years before I even got into the practice, 29 years ago. But now everybody is waking up. Why? Because we have proof, DNA. We have video, what Marty was talking about, proof. So now it's not his word against her word, and it's the people in power who were able to lie, cover it up, exist. That's why I say Harvey Weinstein, right? Power, money can allow these cover-ups to go on with nobody even being able to challenge it. But now, when I have clients and they say, well, what happens if they come back to my house? I'm like, keep your phone on. Keep recording. Don't stop recording. Record. You have a right to record, and record, as you should.
And I think the New York Civil Liberties Union actually has an app now. Yeah. They actually have a really good app that if you get arrested, you just hit the app, and I think it starts to record and will upload the recording directly to their website. Yep. But if you want to talk epidemic of wrongful convictions, last week I had an opportunity to speak to a group of lawyers, law professors that were from China, Japan, Taiwan, and Vietnam. And I didn't realize that even though there were cultural differences, the problems of criminal justice and wrongful convictions are almost exactly the same no matter where you are in the world. I mean, some of their issues are even worse. I mean, I heard one story where I think it's Japan or China, you can be held by law enforcement for 35 days without access to a counsel.
Well, there are years. But somebody else had a question. Go ahead.
Okay, and then this will be the last one because we have coffee and cookies.
I want to just quick on 3 questions. Did your sister have anything to do with the
We don't know exactly, but we know she benefited financially from my conviction, and people have said that she had some relationships to Creedon.
And McCready, she was with the detective.
Yeah.
She was definitely on the other side. Like, the detectives got to her, and she was, like, she would play tennis with McCready's wife or something.
When did you get the counsel?
2004.
And when did you have an opportunity to mourn the death of your parents?
Still not there because the case is still pending. And the truth is still out there. I mean, I still have a civil rights pending, and I have a private investigator who's been out in the last month and is finding out more evidence. And I think until all the truth gets out there, the mourning period, there's a daily mourning, but the full mourning is never going to come out until all the truth gets out. So like McCready, when he talks his crap up there, we videotaped his deposition, okay? So he's dead now, so we'll never get to cross-examine him. But when people see what he said, and he admitted how he lied, and he admitted what he did, I think people will see. I mean, I recently had somebody say, what is it you want people to know? I said, I've been innocent from day one. I'm still innocent. I'll always be innocent. And I want everything to come out. I want people to see what happened to me, because I've said this. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anybody.
Thank you so much, Marty.
Thank you, everybody.